July night in 1966, 8 young women, all nursing students looking forward to promising careers, were brutalized and murdered at the hands of someone who believed he was, quote, born to raise hell, end quote. 8 lives destroyed and families left to painfully mourn due to the selfish, drug and alcohol-crazed fantasies of a coward who possessed no capacity for mercy. On the night of July 14, 1966, at a residence located on Chicago's South Side, nursing student Judy Deighton decided she wanted to study for an exam in the wee hours of the morning. Deighton thought she should better do some laundry before getting her studying done. When she arose from her bed, Deighton turned off the fan she had been running for days due to the extremely hot Chicago weather that summer. When she turned off the fan, Deighton swore she could hear the sounds of what she termed to be like a small animal crying outside in front of the townhouse. At that time, Deighton merely ignored the whimpering and went about doing her laundry. After turning on the washing machine, she went back upstairs to continue her studying. Sitting at a small desk, Deighton heard the crying once more, but at that time she said it sounded like a small child crying. When Deighton pulled the shades of her room open, she saw a woman across the street at 2319 East 100th Street suspended on a ledge. The woman, a very small and what appeared to be Asian lady, kept repeating, quote, "Oh my God, they're all dead," end quote. When Deighton witnessed this, she grabbed something with which to cover herself and ran across the street to investigate. When Deighton reached the residence across the street, she approached the young woman who had been crying, Corazon Amaral, who had been crouched upon a window ledge. Amaral shook uncontrollably and cried incessantly. Deighton entered the residence and walked to the living room. She first discovered a nursing student, Gloria Davy, nude and lying on the couch with her hands tied behind her back, with a strip of cloth in her mouth so tightly jammed that, quote, a roll of skin puffed over the cloth around her neck, end quote. Davy was dead, and her skin took on a bluish tint. Deighton immediately ran to the residence of the house mother, a Mrs. Bissoni, and yelled, quote, "There's trouble in 19, end quote. Mrs. Bissoni awoke some of the other students, and together they made their way down to 2319. When the house mother and the other nursing students made it to the residence, Amaral managed to jump from the 10-foot ledge to the ground and stood on the front stairs, quote, "frozen between the horror in the house and the outside world," end quote. Amaral then screamed, quote, "Everyone on the sampan has been killed," end quote. She stated this over and over again. When Bissone and another nursing student, Leona Bonzak, entered the living room, Bonzak touched Gloria Davy on the leg and said, quote, "Davy," end quote, hoping that the nursing student was only unconscious and not dead. But Davy didn't move. She had already expired. Bonzak left the living room and slowly walked up the stairs to the second floor. When she peered into the bathroom near the landing of the stairs, she found another body. She called out, quote, "Matuzek," end quote. She received no answer. Then Bonzak crept into the other bedrooms upstairs. In both of the bedrooms, Bonzak found the rest of the nursing students who stayed there. The room was covered with blood, and the nursing students appeared brutalized. When she approached one of the other students, Nina Schmale, she removed the pillow that covered her face. Schmale laid on her back with her hands tied, her legs spread apart for all exposure, an apparent knife wound to her chest, and a cloth wrapped very tightly around her neck. Bonzak walked back down the stairs very slowly and met Rizzoni. Bonzak informed Rizzoni not to climb the stairs. They were all dead and nothing could be done. Rizzoni walked over to the telephone and called the South Chicago hospital and stated that all of her, quote, girls, end quote, had been murdered. When the hospital asked her which ones needed help, she said she couldn't talk and just very reservedly stated, quote, I need help, end quote. Outside of the residence, several of the nursing students who accompanied Rizzoni to the crime scene flagged down Officer Daniel Kelly, a mere rookie on the force with 18 months under his belt. Officer Kelly immediately radioed to his precinct and told them that he needed some backup. When Officer Kelly entered the residence, he realized that he knew one of the deceased nurses, Gloria Davy. In the past, Officer Kelly dated Davy's sister. Obviously distraught, he brandished his service revolver and headed up the stairs. When he exited the residence again, he radioed back to the precinct.
Help! 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 Oh my God, I dated her sister. Oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. Oh, give me the sergeant. Give me the lieutenant. My God.
This outpouring of shock was heard by radio police reporter Joe Cummings as he drove around the city's south side to find something newsworthy. Cummings then said to himself that this was big. During his journey to the crime scene, Cummings heard Officer Kelly, who kept saying, "Oh my God, they're all dead," over and over again. After listening to the pleading from Officer Kelly's sergeant as to where the officer called from, Officer Kelly finally gave the address, 2319 East 100th Street. When Cummings finally arrived at the scene, he grabbed his tape recorder and walked off toward Officer Kelly. Bonzak, Dykton, and Rizzoni tried to calm Amarillo down inside a nearby residence located at 2315 East 100th Street. Cummings noticed that Officer Kelly appeared to be walking in circles with his duty hat on backwards and his shirt slightly untucked in the front. Cummings approached the officer and stated that he was a reporter and he was entering the scene and promised that he would not touch anything while in there. Quote, "It's a homicide," end quote, Kelly told Cummings before he walked into 2319. Cummings went in and noticed the dead body of Davy on the couch. Cummings then walked back outside to ask Officer Kelly about just one body. Just then, Officer Kelly then said, quote, "Go upstairs," end quote. Cummings went up to the second floor, looked down the hallway, and turned right. The sun just started to peek over the horizon as morning began, but the whole floor appeared dark. Cummings walked down the hallway and noticed to his right dead bodies of the nursing students. In another room that Cummings investigated, he found 3 more dead bodies, brutally abused. "Oh my God," he whispered to himself. Cummings then turned to walk back down the stairs and past the bathroom where he discovered another body. The reporter noticed a handprint on the bathroom door. Cummings observed fingerprints and that a screen was missing from a window. He said to himself, quote, "What the hell's this? 8 dead women," end quote. As he walked down the stairs, the reporter's stomach began to churn and he felt nauseous. Cummings looked into the living room one more time where Davy's body lay, and when he reached the front entrance, he could hold his sickness no more and vomited in the front yard. As soon as he emptied himself, Cummings again walked up to Officer Kelly and noticed a high-pitched alarm-like noise. Officer Kelly informed the reporter that that was the sole survivor. Seeing a chance at getting ahead of the other reporters, Cummings walked over to 2315 and saw a crack in the door. When he looked in, he observed a doctor injecting Amaral in an attempt to calm the young woman down. Cummings got on his radio and spoke to someone at his radio station that there had just been a mass murder on the south side of Chicago. After calling in some of the details, Cummings went into the crime scene and to the second floor again. He didn't know why, but he did. As he took some further steps into the second floor hallway, Cummings heard a squish with every step. When he looked down at his shoes, he noticed the blood had leaked into the hallway where he walked. Cummings rushed down the stairs and vomited once more. The reporter stated later that in all the years of his reporting, he never saw a crime scene so brutal. A few minutes later, Homicide Commander Frank Flanagan pulled Cummings off to the side and stated to him that he should mention that the victims' throats had been cut. Commander Flanagan stated that every lunatic in the city would confess or take credit for these killings and, quote, leave the particulars out, Only the killer will know what happened to those girls." End quote. Detective Jack Walenda arrived on the scene. Described as a big burly man, even he displayed dismay and horror at the crime scene. When Detective Walenda first examined the body of Gloria Davy, he noticed that her hands had been tied with, quote, "double knots," end quote. Knots that looked like a professional tied them, made from bed sheets. The investigator also noticed that he saw what he thought to be semen between her buttocks. Buttons from Davy's blouse were found all over the stairs. Detective Walenda theorized that the killer must have torn the buttons from Davy's shirt on the way to bring her down the stairs. The investigator also found a man's t-shirt, size 38 to 40, tossed on the floor. Detective Walenda next went up the stairs to one of the bedrooms and discovered the body of Pamela Wilkening. She was gagged and stabbed near her heart. Lying near her was the body of Suzanne Farris, lying face down in a pool of blood with a white nurse's stocking around her neck. Farris had 18 stab wounds to her chest and neck. Suzanne's close friend, Mary Ann Jordan, lay on her back with 3 large stab wounds in her chest, 1 in her neck and 1 in the eye. In the northwest corner of the apartment, Nina Schmale had her night clothes pulled above her breasts with strips of cloth tied around her neck with the familiar knots that Detective Walenda noted on Gloria Davy. Schmale suffered from superficial knife wounds, quote, "in a ritualistic pattern around her neck," end quote, but it appeared that the killer broke her neck. Under a blue cover, Detective Walenda found Valentina Paisan. Her face downward, appeared to have suffered from a deep cut across her throat that bisected her voice box. Across Paisan's body lay another nursing student, Merlita Garguglio, face up, having been strangled and stabbed. When Detective Walenda entered the door through the hallway and to his right, he found the body of Patricia Matusek in the bathroom, lying on her back with her nightgown rolled up to her chest and her panties down. She had been strangled to death. The investigator also noted that it appeared the murderer kicked Matusek in the stomach as she sustained a very large bruise in the abdomen area. Bloody towels covered the floor of the bathroom where Matusek lay. Detective Walenda later remarked that this was the worst crime scene he ever investigated in his long career. The director of nursing was called, and she could only identify 3 of the victims. Once the coroner called for transport of the bodies to the morgue, patrol wagons showed up for the journey as the coroner only had 1 hearse. Law enforcement sealed the house and brought in the crime lab technicians to see if there were any clues as to the identity of the murderer. At this point, police knew they had to find the killer and fast. Immediately, search teams were organized and they canvassed the neighborhood surrounding the crime scene with a description given to them by Emma Rao. She described the man she saw as 6 feet tall, blonde hair, approximately 160 pounds, and he had a southern drawl when he spoke. Detective Edward Wilosinki questioned some people at a local gas station that functioned as a hangout for some pretty questionable characters. Detective Wilosinki discovered that the owner of the gas station heard of a young man who may match that description who left his bags at the gas station 2 days before and was visibly agitated that he missed a ship and lost out on a job. The detective then investigated the clue with another, quote, sweep, end quote, team in questioning people at the Merchant Marine Union Hall on 100th Street. The investigators learned that the agent who gave the assignments through the Union Hall had never heard, nor did he know anyone who matched the description of the killer. Investigators then went back to the gas station and convinced the manager to call the owner of the station, Dick Polo. Awakened from a deep sleep, Polo acknowledged that a young man matching the killer's description came to the station and mentioned that he missed a ship and a job on that ship. The man Polo referenced had a deep southern drawl. Polo recommended a boarding house to the disappointed man. Flop houses and bars were thoroughly canvassed. Then the investigators decided to go back to the Merchant Marine Union Hall to speak with the booking agent once again. Putting pressure on the nervous man, he paused any conversation he carried with the investigators, went to his trash basket, and pulled out an assignment sheet. On that piece of paper, the agent read aloud the name of Richard B. Speck. The agent remembered the man because of his heavy southern drawl that, at the time, The agent barely understood what he was saying. Detective Wilisinski found Speck's file at the Union Hall, and he matched the description perfectly, but he had no criminal record locally. The search for Speck began in earnest, and it seemed that the police kept missing him from wherever he went. On the morning of July 14th, the day of the murders, Speck walked into a dive bar known as Pete's Tap at approximately 10:30 a.m., well-rested, showered, and looking neat. Bar patrons noticed that Speck carried a large knife attached to his belt that he gave to the bartender to hold. A month before, Speck pawned a jeweled watch which the bartender, Ray Crawford, purchased soon thereafter. Speck had some money in his pocket and bought the watch back from Crawford. During Speck's visit to the bar, he managed to sneak behind it, grab the knife, and then put the bartender in a chokehold, placing the knife to the man's throat. It was then that Speck stated that is how he would kill someone. Then he released Crawford, who didn't think the action proved funny at all. When Speck sat back at the bar, he weaved tremendous falsities about how he killed people in Vietnam. William Kirkland, another barfly, purchased the knife from Speck, who claimed it belonged to a veteran. But in actuality, Speck's brother-in-law, Gene Thornton, gave him the knife. Speck now had a drinking partner for the night, and he and Kirkland went across the street to another dive known as the Soco Grad. The two men continued their drinking at the bar, and Speck learned that he left a survivor at the scene. He turned to Kirkland when he learned the news and stated, "It must have been some dirty that done it." Speck told another tale of how he hit his brother-in-law over the head with a bottle, causing his sister to throw him out of the house. The wanted man then claimed that his sister gave him $85, and so he left the residence. The rest of the night included Speck and an old drinking buddy, Robert R. Red Gerald, another Southern boy. The two drank until Gerald became too ill and finally decided he needed to get some sleep. Speck brought Gerald to the room that the former rented at the Shipyard Inn. Speck left his buddy there while he continued his binge. While Speck went to the bar located downstairs at the boarding house, Detective Wilisinski suggested strongly to the booking agent at the Union Hall to call Speck at his last known telephone number and tell him that he had a job for him. As luck would have it, when the agent telephoned the Shipyard Inn, Speck answered the call. The agent informed Speck that he needed to report to the Union Hall immediately to gather his assignment on a ship called the Sinclair Great Lakes. Speck felt something suspicious as he knew that the Sinclair had sailed from Chicago a few days before, and he told the agent that he was up north and it would take him some time to get to the Union Hall. Speck never materialized. The suspected murderer awoke his friend and brought his bags downstairs, calling for a cab. Gerald sat on the curb, holding his head as he still felt the effects of the drinking marathon. Leaving his comrade on the curb, the accused killer played pool by himself inside the Shipyard Inn until the cab arrived. Just then, 3 detectives walked into the bar and began asking questions of the patrons while Speck listened, never indicating that he was the man they were looking for. When the cabbie arrived at the bar, he walked in and shouted, quote, "Commercial," end quote. Speck swigged down his drink and left the premises by the side door. Gerald and Speck entered the cab, and Speck instructed the cabbie to head north toward his sister's house. The cabbie became suspicious when Speck could not give the address of his sister's house, claiming it was in some seedy part of Chicago. The cabbie drove to a place known as Cabrini Green, a slum. One of the residents of the area that witnessed Speck exiting the taxi stated that she could not understand a white man with suitcases wanting to come to this area of town. Speck then walked to the Raleigh Inn, another Fleabag hotel, and coerced his way into letting the manager, Ota Hullinger, to rent him a room under the alias of, quote, John Staten, end quote. Once a hotel of grandeur, the Raleigh in the 1960s had devolved into a single-room flophouse, the perfect place for a ne'er-do-well such as Speck to get lost. One of the clerks working there remembered a man matching Speck's description coming to the hotel with a black prostitute. The clerk also remembered that the prostitute called the man she was with, quote, Richard, end quote. Later, with the transaction completed, the young black girl came down and informed the clerk that John Staten had a gun. On the following morning, the clerk, Algie Lemhart, called the police and asked them to come and sort it out. 2 police officers arrived at approximately 8:30 that morning, and when Speck awoke, groggy of course from the drinking he'd done the night before, 2 police officers stood over the hungover Speck and questioned him for a little over 15 minutes. In hindsight, it appeared that not all police precincts were aware that a mass murderer was at large, in addition to not knowing the physical description of the suspect. The officers checked his identification and passport. With the recent brush with the detectives at the Shipyard Inn and the 2 police officers at the Raleigh, Speck considered himself very lucky up to this point. The officers confiscated the weapon and never reported it to their watch commander. As they left the hotel, they informed the clerk that Speck was, quote, harmless, end quote. Later that evening, Speck hit the dive bars in the area, finally arriving at the Pink Twist Inn, where he drank more and lulled himself into another of many drunken stupors. Even though the trails of communication were slow, the Chicago Police Department wanted to make sure whom they were dealing with. They asked for assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the fingerprints acquired at the crime scene. Investigators then tracked the suspect from the Shipyard Inn through the commercial cab company, and when they interviewed the cab driver, they learned that Speck was dropped off in Cabrini Green. Sergeant Mike Clancy, one of the members of the task force hunting Speck, reached Speck's sister and retraced his steps from the time he left Dallas some time ago. Then the police picked up Red Gerald, who gave the investigators a very specific itinerary of Speck's movements. At this point, police issued a stop order for the Union Hall if Speck were to show up there. In his further attempt to evade the dragnet that closed in around him, Speck walked out of the Raleigh Inn, stating that he was going to do his laundry. The manager and the clerk never saw Speck again. The suspect then met with 2 winos who convinced him to stay at the Star Hotel, another flophouse. One of the winos, a guy named One Eye, told Speck that he would show him how to jump freight trains and travel the country. But One Eye grew tired of Speck and tried to ditch him. Speck, at this time, seemed desperate to get away from the city. One Eye stated that he wanted to stay in the city to make some more money as a day laborer. Speck then abandoned the idea to hop freights and then went to sell some of his possessions. On the morning of July 17, 1966, Commander Flanagan learned that the fingerprint they retrieved from the crime scene matched Speck's fingerprints. When police officers learned this fact, some of them cried, but others took on more of a sense of urgency to locate this killer. With this evidence in hand, the State Attorney General's office issued a warrant for Richard Speck's arrest. The young assistant attorney in the state office typed up the arrest warrant, but he wanted the press handled efficiently so that Speck would not slip through the dragnet. But this concern arose too late, as the police chief already called a press conference to identify the killer. After Speck sold some more of his belongings on Skid Row, he went to the local liquor store and purchased a small bottle of wine and a few newspapers. By this time, he knew the police were on to him as he saw his face splattered across the papers. Speck rushed back to his rented room at the Star Hotel, drank the wine, and in a drunken rage, broke the wine bottle and attempted to slash his wrists and his inner elbow with the broken glass. Speck then dragged himself to One Eye's cubicle, then switched cubicles to be in his own. With the newspaper strewn on the floor near the bed and his profuse bleeding onto that floor, he felt soon he would not have to face the consequences of his actions. When One Eye returned to the hotel, he began walking around to see what friends remained. When he reached Speck's cubicle, he saw the blood and immediately called the police to report the man that they were looking for was located at the Star Hotel. When the ambulance and the police arrived, they rushed Speck to Cook County Hospital, the same hospital that housed the bodies of the nurses he murdered. And when doctors and nurses prepared him for surgery to close the wounds he made, when the doctor, a first-year resident by the name of Dr. Leroy Smith, noticed that the patient had a tattoo. Using his own spit to clear away the blood so he could see it more clearly, he noticed the ink on the patient's arm that read, quote, "Born to raise hell," end quote. Speck consistently pleaded to the doctor to give him water. The doctor hurriedly asked the attending nurse to grab the newspaper from the other room that contained Speck's photograph. When Speck pled for more water, Dr. Smith grabbed the back of Speck's neck and stated quite angrily, "Did you give water to the nurses?" Dr. Smith then released his grip from behind Speck's head and summoned a police officer down the hall to inform him that the man he will soon be operating on to save his life is the same man police searched for within the last 3 days. The policeman then called his commanding officer and let them know that Richard Speck was lying on a gurney awaiting surgery to repair the arteries he cut through. Once authorities learned that Richard Speck was a medical captive at the hospital, they pushed their way through the halls to make sure he did not escape justice. Richard Speck was born in Monmouth, Illinois on December 6, 1941, the seventh of 8 children to Benjamin Franklin Speck and Mary Margaret Carbaugh Speck. Speck and his younger sister, Carolyn, were much younger than their other siblings. Speck's father made a living to support his huge family as a packer for the Western Stoneware Company and had previously worked as a farmer and logger. Benjamin Speck died of a heart attack when Richard was 6 years old. Speck's mother then remarried to a man who was the exact opposite of his father. Speck's stepfather, Carl August Randolph Lindbergh, spent most of his adult life in correctional institutions and maintained a high level of alcoholism. He often beat young Speck and abused him verbally as well. Speck did poorly in school and needed glasses, but refused to wear them. Because of his disinterest in school, Speck dropped out at the age of 16. This is when his worst problem came to the surface and got worse. Speck started drinking alcohol at the age of 12, and at 15 years old, he became drunk almost every day. From the age of 16, Speck committed various offenses, often being sentenced to short stretches and then released. Also at this age, Speck married a young girl, but their relationship was filled with violence and alcohol-fueled arguments. Speck continued to work odd little jobs in Texas until July of 1963, when Speck tried to cash a fellow employee's paycheck, in addition to stealing some cigarettes, beer, and $3 in cash. The court sentenced him to 3 years, but the state of Texas released him after 16 months for serving time in Huntsville prison. Less than a week after his parole, Speck brandished a knife and threatened a woman in the parking lot of her apartment complex. Again, the court for this case gave him 16 months in prison, but due to a typographical error, Speck saw freedom after 6 months. Speck continued his career, committing petty crimes until one day in 1966, his sister Carolyn drove him to the Greyhound station and put him on a bus headed for Chicago. Speck stayed a few days with his sister, Martha Thornton, and then went to the place of his birth, Monmouth, Illinois. There he stayed with his brother's family and got a job as a carpenter's helper. Again, a job he held for a short period of time. When Speck learned that the woman he married at 16 remarried 2 days after their divorce, he moved from his brother's house and into one of the local hotels. Speck drank heavily and very rarely remained sober. On April 3, 1966, Mrs. Virgil Harris, 65, returned to her home after babysitting at 1 a.m. when she confronted a burglar, a man about 6 feet tall, and spoke with a thick southern drawl. He tied her up, raped her, and then stole the money she earned from babysitting that evening, $2.50. On or about April 10th, a bartender named Mary Kay Pierce left the tavern at 12:25 a.m. on April 9th. Her brother-in-law, Frank, reported her missing on April 13th. Police found Pierce's body in an empty log house behind the tavern, having died from, quote, a blow to her abdomen that ruptured her liver, end quote. After Speck's arrest as the suspect of the murder of the 8 nurses, authorities wondered whether he may have been responsible for the rape of Mrs. Harris and then the death of Miss Pierce. Police questioned Speck considerably regarding both Harris's assault and Pierce's murder. When the police searched his room, they discovered some costume jewelry that Mrs. Harris reported missing. Investigators also knew that Speck frequented the bar where Pierce worked. In April 1966, Speck returned to his sister's apartment on the northwest side of Chicago, where she lived with her husband, Gene Thornton, and their 2 teenage daughters. Thornton knew that Speck could not hold down a job, and being a veteran of the U.S. Navy, strongly suggested to Speck that he join the Merchant Marine Service. After providing fingerprints, being photographed and cleared from a physician, Speck found work immediately, but suffered an appendicitis and had to be brought back to shore in order to recuperate. After recovering from the surgery, Speck joined the crew of the ship, where he got drunk and had an altercation with one of the officers on board. His brother-in-law then suggested that Speck apply to the local Merchant Marine Hall for a seaman's card, so he would find other jobs on other ships. From May to July 1966, Speck found difficulty in holding down a job. On July 8th, Thornton took his brother-in-law to the Seaman's Hall to pick up his card and register for a berth on a ship. Speck discovered that he lost out to a seaman with more seniority on a ship headed for South Vietnam. On the 11th, Speck again took a ride from Thornton to the hall to await a berth. This time, he overstayed his welcome at his sister's and looked for lodging elsewhere. The same thing happened on the following day. He registered for a berth only to see it go to someone else. On this date, Speck dropped off his bags at the Manor Shell filling station and then slept the night in an unfinished house. On July 13th, after Speck picked up his bags and registered at the Seaman's Hall, he then sat in his brother-in-law's car with his sister, and they spoke for the next 30 minutes. Incidentally, Thornton parked the car across the street from where the student nurses lived. Later that afternoon and early evening, with the remainder of the $25 his sister Martha lent to him earlier in the day, Speck visited various taverns in the area and met a woman named Ella Mae Cooper, whom Speck raped later that evening and stole her .22 caliber Rome revolver, a cheap Saturday night special. After eating at Kay's Pilot House, Speck returned to the Shipyard Inn and drank until approximately 10:20, dressed all in black and armed with a pocket knife, a hunting knife, and the .22 caliber revolver. From there, he walked a mile and a half west to the nurse's townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street. At approximately 11 p.m., Speck broke into the nurse's townhouse, which served as a dormitory for nursing students, predominantly some exchange students from the Philippines. Once Speck entered the residence, and for hours Speck methodically rounded up the nursing students and brought them into one room, raping them and then stabbing them to death. Investigators who put together the series of events for that evening believe that Gloria Davy was his last victim. Corazon Amaral managed to escape the carnage by shimmying under a bed while Speck was outside of the main room with another one of the victims. Amaral stayed hidden until approximately 6 a.m. when she ran to an upstairs window and made her way onto the ledge, where she started screaming,
"They're all dead! All my friends are dead!"
While still at the hospital, Speck made a confession to Dr. Leroy Smith. But because he was heavily sedated at the time, the confession could not be used against him. Eventually, Speck stated that he was on drugs and alcohol and could not remember anything that happened that evening. Later, one of the state prosecutors stated that although they knew of the confession, because of Corazon Amaral as the state star witness, they didn't need the confession. With all the evidence they needed, the trial of Richard Speck began on April 3, 1967, with the star witness, Amaral, dramatically identifying Speck as the man who murdered her friends. When the prosecution asked Amaral to identify the man she saw that July 13th evening and the morning of the 14th, she, quote, rose from her seat in the witness box, walked directly in front of Speck, and pointed her finger at him, nearly touching him, and said, "This is the man." Lieutenant Emil Geiss, the fingerprint expert for the Chicago Police Department, then testified as to the authenticity of the fingerprints found at the scene compared to Speck's fingerprints. The state believed with this evidence and Amaral's testimony that Speck murdered and brutalized the nurses. On April 15th, after Judge Herbert J. Passion charged the jury, they deliberated for approximately 49 minutes and found Speck guilty on 8 counts of murder and strongly recommended the death penalty be imposed as punishment. Because of the imposition of the death penalty, an automatic appeal taken, The Illinois Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction in November of 1968. On June 28, 1971, the United States Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction but overturned the death sentence. On June 29, 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, so the Illinois Supreme Court's only option was to resentence Speck to life imprisonment. On November 21, 1972, Judge Richard Fitzgerald resentenced Speck to 400 to 1,200 years in prison, 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 100 years. When he appeared before the parole hearing in 1976, the board denied Speck's request in 7 minutes. The pardon board then denied Speck parole 6 more times after that. Speck began his incarceration at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He gained a reputation as the, quote, Birdman, end quote, after he kept a pair of sparrows that flew into his cell. But the warden often described him as a, quote, big nothing doing time, end quote. Speck never gained a reputation as a model prisoner either, often being caught with drugs or moonshine alcohol. Speck scoffed at the punishment when he stated, quote, how am I going to get in any trouble? I'm here for 1,200 years, end quote. In the only interview he gave to Bob Greene in 1978 for the Chicago Tribune, he finally confessed to the murders. Speck stated that one of his biggest pleasures in prison was getting high. The convicted murderer stated that he did not expect to be in prison past the year 2000, where, after his release, he planned to run a grocery store. In his final quote to the newspaper, Speck stated that he had a message for the American people.
Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know it keeps up morale, and I don't know what I would do without it.